Hello and welcome to the final lecture on week 3, our focus on personal identity over time. We've covered Locke's psychological continuity account of personal identity, and then we've seen Derek Parfit's more contemporary account, which introduces a few new concepts, right, and says that maybe psychological connectedness as opposed to continuity is what we really care about when we talk about the self. Um, so now we're going to move back in time again to a sort of contemporary of Locke, David Hume. And Hume tends to be sort of a skeptic about everything, right? So he has um, writes about causation and skeptical whether there's any such thing as causation. We'll see him later on laws of nature, and he has a very sort of minimal sort of account of what laws of nature are. So he tends to shy away from any sort of what we'd say thick metaphysical posits, and when you ask him what sort of stuff is there in the universe, he's gonna want a relatively short list, right? And he's in this passage, which you read, he's subjected the self to the same sort of like skeptical, uh, uh, I'm going to say criticism, what's the word I'm saying? Examination. So Hume starts with something that Locke said earlier, right? And Locke said that every thought or sensation, any conscious experience is accompanied by a sense of self, right? As of it's me that's having this, right? So I, whatever, taste an apple, and the experience is Locke claims of me tasting the apple, right? Everything is accompanied by it. It's me doing it. Now, Locke doesn't really offer an argument for that claim. He seems to think that it's just obviously true, right? Um, it's sort of one of his more basic premises that he builds other stuff off of, right? Um, and Hume wants to say, well, you didn't really offer an argument for it, and it's not at all actually obviously true to me that some sense of self, right, is always carried around with me with all my experiences. So a little background: Hume is an empiricist, as is Locke, right? What and as opposed to Descartes, who is known usually called a rationalist. So an empiricist says all of our knowledge comes from experience, it comes through the senses, right? Descartes said no, we cannot actually trust the senses, or we have to do a lot of work to get to where we can trust the senses, and really, right, our basic knowledge comes actually from our own minds and from logic, right? So the empiricist tradition is different. Empiricists probably more sort of in line with contemporary thinking about this kind of thing. Yeah, if you ask the everyday person on the street, how do you know what you know? Well, yeah, through the senses, through experience, uh, even sort of reports from others. I get them through my ears or through my eyes or whatever, textbooks and so on. Okay. So the empiricist story is every idea, right? All the content in your head, anything that's in your head came through the senses. So it began as some sort of impression on the senses. So you looked at a tree, right? And that impression gave you an idea of a tree, right? That you can recall if you want to think about trees, right? But it started out as a sense impression. Right? And Hume says we don't have any sort of impression of a self. Now, obviously, you can see yourself in a mirror, right? But he's asking about something sort of deeper, right? What is the, because as we've seen, right, the self is not necessarily just the body. The body changes and stuff, right? The self is supposed to be something that is identical across time. Now we've seen Parfit question whether identity is the right relation here, but now we're back with Hume, and he's engaging with Locke. And so if we're talking about something that's identical throughout our whole lives that we would call our self, um, it can't just be your appearance in a mirror, right? Um, and he thinks there's not really ever any sensory impression of the self, right, of the pure self, right? Um, you don't see it, hear it, or smell it, right? So, um, and the reason he says, as I sort of just said, why we think that there's no impression of self is because, again, if the self is what's identical over time, then it would be the same thing all the time, right? Um, and we don't have any sense impressions that are the same all the time. The whole world is constantly changing, right? Um, So Hume thinks what we really experience, right, is this sort of parade of like changing impressions, right? You wake up in the morning and maybe you smell coffee and you have these visual experiences of moving from room to room, right? And you hear people talking and you watch this lecture and you have all these various sense impressions throughout the day and throughout every day and throughout your life. And they're just constantly changing. There's no one single element that's the same throughout all of them. In fact, if you just sort of sit here and try it, okay, let me see if I can catch an impression of myself, right? Okay, what is my sense experience right now? Um, I'm usually having some experience, right? But again, it's always going to be different. So I'm having an experience of a white wall. I'm smelling some glue that I was using earlier. I'm hearing a bird, right? So there's certainly a lot of things that are right impressed on me by the senses, but a self, some sort of pure self, is not really among them, right? Or it's certainly not one of the first things you'd rattle off when I said, "Ah, what are you experiencing right now?" Right? Well, first and foremost, the self. You usually don't say that. And he wants to say, yeah, that's exactly the case. All you perceive are sort of perceptions of the world. You're not perceiving something extra on top of that. That would be the self. Even when you're not perceiving anything, or if there are moments where maybe you're in a deep sleep and you're just no perception whatsoever, even then you're not perceiving a self, right? You're experiencing literally nothing, right? Um, that's kind of probably what death is for him, like the absence of all experience. He was also kind of an atheist, right? Um, so, this is all what we call phenomenology, right? This is Hume introspecting on his own experience and saying, where's the self that Locke is talking about? I don't notice it anywhere, right? Um, Now you could do the same thing, right? Maybe you notice the self, right? That's possible. Just, Hume, right, with a sort of we say an N of one, right? There's like one subject in his little experiment, and it's him, and he's appearing in his own mind. Who's to say he's representative of the entire human race? Um, but he seems to think that, if when you introspect, you say, ah, there's the self, and it's the same every single time, all day long, my whole life. He says, wow, that's your very different sort of being. And, I guess I agree with Hume on this. I don't notice anything identical through all my different sense impressions that I would identify with a self necessarily. Right? So Hume says, if you insist on calling something the self, um, at most it would just have to be whatever the bundle of perceptions you get at any given time, right? So in this moment, there is a self. It's just my, white wallness impression, my glue smell impressions that I'm getting, right? My bird sounds, just that whole package, right? That's just me in this moment, right? It seems to change from moment to moment. So here's a little quote from Hume. He says, "The mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations," right? That's his description of like your world, right? Constantly changing, morphing around, coming back, and so on. But even though he uses this metaphor of a theater, even that's a little too strong, right? Because there's not actually an audience, right, or a stage, or even a screen. Um, there's just the impressions. So for Hume, right, there's no self as sort of Locke conceives it, or as probably the everyday person in the street would conceive it. There's no sort of unifying thinker that's somehow the center of gravity of all these various perceptions. Um, he says at most there is the various bundles of perceptions. Right? All we Again, that's all we ever experience, and again, he's an empiricist, so any idea we would have of a self would have to come from experience, and so at most a self is just a bundle of experiences. So that's Hume's argument. It's fairly brief, right? But and, I mean, many people find it fairly compelling, right? Um, I thought it would be interesting to delve into a couple sort of Buddhist sutras that reach a similar conclusion to Hume. Now, it's not clear whether Hume was acquainted with Buddhism, right? But we can see some parallels nonetheless. Either he learned it at some point, or because this is definitely earlier than Hume, right? Um, or sort of these two traditions sort of like independently kind of came to the same view of the self. So these sutras, these are very fairly old, and often argumentation is slightly different in the Eastern tradition. So for us who are accustomed to the sort of Western kind of argumentation, it takes a little work, a little interpretation to sometimes sort of reconstruct the argument. And I'm certainly not an expert in this realm, so I'm doing my best to reconstruct these arguments. I only have a little more experience than you. There's people who are experts at this. This first one we're going to look at, the Pankavaji Sutra, and I maybe mispronounced that, right? The sort of the argumentative strategy is to survey a few things that you might think you could identify with the self, concludes none of those could be the self, and then the implication is, well, then maybe there is no self, right? And no self is a Buddhist doctrine, right? So here's some of the things, right, that they check out. Maybe the self is this. So one is form, right? And I'm interpreting this as the body, right? Are you your body, right? Definitely my body exists. So if we could just say, I just am my body, then we know what the self is, right? I mean, we've already seen in the past the problems with it. The body can change, and yet we want to say the self is identical across time. They have a different refutation of that. They say, well, look, if the self were the body, they say there would be no dis-ease, right? What do they mean by dis-ease? They seem to mean by that some sort that the body's sort of recalcitrant, or like fails to obey what we want, right? They say, oh, if the self was the body, then you can just sort of simply decide how your body should be, and it would just do it, right? So um, implicit in here seems to be the idea that the self may be associated with the will, right? Or it's some sort of pure thing that you can just totally sort of decide. It just is you, and it is sort of subject to whatever you want. And the body is not completely within our total control. Some control over it, but not the degree that they seem to think self we have control over, right? Um, and similarly, they consider mental states. Okay, maybe you are your mind, right? Maybe you're your consciousness, which is what Locke seems to think, right? Or maybe some other kind of mental state. Um, and they say, well, for the same reason, right? If you were your mind, then there would be no mental disease, right? You would have total control of your mind, right? If that were you. And again, implied here is that whatever the self is, you seem to have total control over. In the same sutra, we see, I think, what could be interpreted as a separate argument, right? Also talking about form and mental states, right? Where we think of form maybe as the body. And they say, look, form and mental states are inconstant, but the self should be constant. And this is what this is what Hume was saying too, right? Well, if the self is identical over time, then it should be the same, right, every time you experience it, if you experience it. And here they're making the same assumption, right? This thing that is identical across time, it must be constant, right? It must always be the same. Um, and since your body changes and your mental states change, right, you can't be identified with either of those. There's also sort of a implicit in this, and I think this is maybe implicit in a lot of Buddhist sort of philosophy, right? There's these descriptive claims and also a sort of normative claim, and particularly in this sutra, they seem to be mixed together. So later they say, look, you should try to be free of inconstant, stressful things, right? And instead, you should identify yourself with something. Um, so you've got certain claims about this says, oh, the self is constant, and another claim that says, well, you ought to identify with something that's. These are two separate claims. One is about just the nature of the world, and the other is what you should do, right? Um, so these will give us different sort of conclusions, right? For sure, one would be a metaphysical conclusion, one would be sort of an ethical, normative conclusion, right? Telling you what to do. Um, so it's not clear in this argument which is which, right? You could maybe interpret it both ways. Um, so a couple of different, potential. I see sort of at least three different potential interpretations of what was going on in that last sutra, um, but all coming to the same conclusion that we shouldn't identify the self with any of these candidates so far, and sort of the implicit conclusion maybe there is no self, right? This next sutra, uh, which again I'll probably pronounce Sutra, uh, this is known as the Six Sextets, right? It's a slightly different argument, similar conclusion. It surveys, again, number of things, right, that we encounter in the world and asks, is this the self? Is this the self? Is this the self? Um, and here they structure it in six sets of six, right? So the six types of things um, that we might think we could identify with the self are number one, what they call internal media. So these appear to be like the parts of the body which sort of correspond to the senses. So your eyes, am I my eyes? Am I my ears? Am I my nose? Tongue, body, intellect, right? What part of the body is the intellect? Maybe the brain? Not sure. Maybe it's a physical thing for them. Um, right? The second set of things are the external media. So these are sort of the objective things in the world that cause sensory experience. So form, sound, aroma, flavor, right? So I think interpreting sound here, I mean, I don't know what their science was at the time. You could sort of, by sound here, with external media, they mean like the literal, the vibrating air, right? Um, Third, you might identify the self with consciousness that each of these elicit. So, right, the external media vibrates, right, and then it hits my internal media, my ear, and then I have a conscious experience of sound, right, of a song or something. That would be the third category of things that I might identify with the self. Fourth are the types of contact involved in each sensation. So that seems to be the causal, right, interaction. Fifth, the types of feelings that arise from each. Now that's interesting, right? In sort of contemporary philosophy, we would say, for example, if I'm hearing a sound, that the feeling and the sound, the conscious sound, are the same. The Buddhists seem, in this sutra, seem to distinguish the conscious experience from the feeling, right? And six, the forms of craving that arise from each. So Buddhists are very concerned with craving. They're getting rid of desire. They think desire is a source of all unhappiness. By the way, I'm talking about Buddhists. They're a single thing. There's so many different varieties of Buddhism, right? But at least from what I studied, it's sort of the more sort of the initial form, right, of Buddhism. Is what I'm sort of thinking of here. It's developed and branched out in many ways, right, since the days of the actual Buddha. Okay, so these are all things that you might associate with the self. And then I won't go through it's a little repetitive, maybe a little meditative, right? Um, but basically, for each of these six sets, they say, hey, well, each of these they can't be the self. Why? Because they sort of arise and they pass away, right? So I've got eyes. One day I will no longer have eyes, right? Or that I could lose my eyes. Um, Conscious experiences certainly come and go, and all the other things, right? Desires come and go, and so on. So, for example, for sensations, right? Yeah, I'm not a smell. I'm not my nose. I'm not the consciousness or my contact with the smell, right? Each of the six things. I'm not the feeling or the craving. Now, one of the things they said was intellect, right? I think Locke might say, you are the intellect, right? But Buddhists say, no, that comes and goes too. And they don't quite get into the details of how that comes and goes, right? Um, it could be an interesting paper to try to sort of flesh these arguments out, consider objections, and then respond to them. Um, Try to make them more plausible. Often, what historical philosophers, right, that are focused on um, figures from the past, often spend a lot of time sort of like taking an argument that seems like sort of got some gaps or missing some parts and try to fill it in and consider objections and try to make sense of like what Kant really meant, what Locke really meant, or what these right Buddhist authors really meant. That could be an interesting paper as well. A lot of open space here for you to sort of be creative and fill in. So, earlier I talked about, is this a descriptive claim that they're arguing for or a normative one? Is this about what the self is, right, if the self exists, or is this about what we should strive to identify ourselves with? And this argument seems sort of more obviously descriptive, right? The world as it is, but it does end with a bit of a normative component too. And I think often, right, these sutras are meant not only as sort of philosophical arguments, but also as sort of like teaching, right, of how to live your life. Um, so at the end, right, they say, look, once we've learned that all these six sextets are temporary, we tend to become disenchanted with them, right? If you thought you were wanted to identify yourself with your consciousness, your intellect, once you realize that it's going to come and go, you become less interested in identifying with it, and eventually, right, the goal is sort of to detach yourself from all these worldly cravings. And one sort of, I think, and this goes beyond the reading, but just my understanding of Buddhism, you might think it's sort of a little nihilistic, right? That it like sort of like encourages you just to detach from the whole world, right? And just sort of sit under a Bodhi tree or something and not engage. But the end point typically for him is once you've freed yourself of sort of these negative or unhelpful cravings and attachments, then you can get back into engagement with the world and sort of be useful in the world. Okay, so that was relatively short, right? Again, some fairly quick arguments from Hume and a couple of Buddhist texts, uh, all again arguing for the claim that it's not clear that at all that there is some particular self that we can identify with, right? At most, there's just these fleeting sort of sensations. Right? Why do we need a self? Why is it so important? And then sort of their answer to the puzzle of personal identity over time then might be that no, there is no personal identity over time because there's no self, so there's no problem to worry about, right? So they solving the problem. Um, but there is a certain tension with common sense here, right? You know, we'd like to be able to convict someone for murder if they in fact committed murder, right? And if there's no self that is the same between the earlier and the later, then that seems to create problems there. So um, solve some problems, but also create some, right? And that's pretty common with philosophical arguments.